The following video has been produced to help educate my father, the climate skeptic. Despite numerous discussions, my dad continuously believes that humans have had an insignificant impact on Earth's climate. Specifically, his favorite go-to line is, "People always talk about carbon in the atmosphere being bad, but it only makes up a small part of the atmosphere. Only the sun is powerful enough to change Earth's climate." Well, Dad, here are the facts. Earth's atmosphere is predominantly made from a stable balance of nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. Carbon dioxide, known as CO2, makes up around 0.04% of the atmosphere. Despite this small concentration, CO2, along with small amounts of methane, water vapor, and other trace gases, combine to create an efficient greenhouse effect, a potent cocktail that allows the atmosphere to absorb 23% of the sun's energy. Without these greenhouse gases, Earth's temperature would plummet from a relatively warm 15 degrees Celsius to a frigid negative 18 degrees Celsius. We are also fortunate our atmosphere doesn't have a significant concentration of CO2, like Venus, which experiences a runaway greenhouse effect. Therefore, the presence of CO2 and greenhouse gases in the correct quantities is crucial in enabling life to occur on Earth. Scientists use atmospheric CO2 as a measuring stick because of the distinct relationship it has with temperature. Studies of Antarctic ice cores dating back 800,000 years show a very strong correlation between rising and falling CO2 levels with rising and falling temperatures. Historically, CO2 and temperature rose and fell based on astronomical mechanisms and natural phenomena. Milankovitch cycles, ice albedo feedback loops, and to a lesser extent, volcanic output were the major driving forces behind our ancient climate. Milankovitch cycles refer to the change in eccentricity, tilt, and wobble of Earth in relationship to its axis and the Sun. These mechanisms alter the amount of energy Earth receives, where it receives it, and how long it receives it for. This then drives the ice albedo feedback loop, which can be demonstrated in two ways. One that reinforces lower temperatures and ice creation, and another that reinforces higher temperatures and ice melting. When oceans and plant life freeze over, their stored CO2 becomes sequestered for thousands of years, until when the ice melts and it gets re-released. The Antarctic ice cores tell us a story of an always cooling and warming Earth in line with natural forces. However, over the past 200 years or so, there has been a dramatic hockey stick trend of rising CO2 levels that is inconsistent with these natural forces. Rising CO2 levels are indistinguishably aligned with modern population growth and unrelenting resource use that has accelerated since the Industrial Revolution in the late 1700s. This abrupt and steep uptick represents where humans took over as the major contributor and influencer of CO2 in the atmosphere. If it were a relay race, the sun would have just handed us the baton, and we're now running off. CO2 concentration in the atmosphere last reached 300 parts per million some 325,000 years ago, which is roughly 125,000 years before our species existed. Then, in the early 1900s, we exceeded 300 parts per million for the first time in nearly 3 million years. It now sits at 411 parts per million, which is 37% higher than at any time in the past 800,000 years. Based on the trends seen in the Arctic ice cores, Earth should in fact be experiencing a decline in atmospheric CO2 and temperature, not increasing for both like we see now. When our large carbon sinks of the oceans and forests can no longer sequester CO2, it will begin to linger in the atmosphere for 300 to 1,000 years. By this trend, we can see that our carbon sinks are already struggling to keep up with the amount of CO2 we are releasing. Concern for current and future CO2 levels is based on our knowledge of how greenhouse gases work and the story that historical ice core data over the past 800,000 years tells us. So why does this all matter? The issue isn't that CO2 is bad, it's that too much of it in the atmosphere will lead to rising temperatures. Higher temperatures will alter and destabilize the delicate relationship of interconnected weather and Earth systems. This means our natural resources become harder to utilize and that weather events become more extreme and less predictable. Ultimately, This creates uninvited burdens for human lives and livelihoods. Current trends paint a picture of a world at the tipping point of major climate change that humans are not properly preparing themselves for. So when you say, humans have had an insignificant impact on Earth's climate, it brushes aside the fact that our actions have consequences. By labeling it a human issue, we are saying there are human solutions.